Hi, it's Amy. I'm here with part two of Boyhood reading in Confessions of a Book Lover by Maurice-Francis-Egan. And if you haven't watched or listened to part one yet, I would suggest you go and check out that video first before listening to this one, as I read through the first 37 or so pages in that video. But we're continuing on here with the Bible, where he's going to talk about his early reading of the Bible. The glimpses I had of the Bible, some of which rather prejudiced me as a moral child against the sacred book, were however of inestimable value. Of course, the New Testament was always open to me, and I read it constantly as a pleasure. The language, both in the Douay version and the King James version, was often very obscure, although I soon learned to recognize the beauty of the 23rd Psalm in the King James Version, which I always read when I went to one of my cousins. I found the sonorous Latinisms of the Douay Version interesting. For a time, I was limited to a book of Bible stories given us to read at school, as it was considered unwise to permit children to read the Old Testament unexpurgated. After a while, however, the embargo seemed to be raised for some reason or other, and again I was allowed to revel with a great deal of profit in the wonderful poems, prophecies, and histories of the Old Testament. I soon discovered that it was impossible to understand the allusions in English literature without a knowledge of the Bible. What would Ruth among the alien corn mean to a reader who had never known the beauty of the story of Ruth? And the lilies of the field, permeating all poetical literature, would have lost all their perfume if one knew nothing about the Song of Solomon. Putting aside the question as to whether young readers should be let loose in the Old Testament or not, or whether modern ideas of purity are justified in including ignorance as the supremest virtue, he who does not make himself familiar with biblical ideas and phraseology finds himself in afterlife with an incomplete medium of expression. It used to be said of the typical English gentleman that all he needed to know was to ride after the hounds and to construe Horace. This is not so absurd, after all, as it appears to be to most moderns. To construe Horace, of course, meant that he should have at least a speaking acquaintance with one of the masterpieces of Roman literature, and this knowledge gave him a grip on the universal speech of all cultivated people. However, useless his allusions to Chloe and to Maecenas were in the business of practical life, he was at least able to understand what they meant, and even a slight acquaintance with the Latin stamped him as speaking the speech of a gentleman. Similarly, a man who knows the Scriptures is fitted with allusions that clarify and illuminate the ordinary speech. He may not have any technical knowledge, or his technical knowledge may be so great as to debar him from meeting other men in conversation on equal grounds, but his reading of the Bible gives his speech or writing a background, a color, a metaphorical strength, which illuminate even the commonplace. Strike the Bible from the sphere of any man's experience, and he is in a measure left out of much of that conversation which helps to make life endurable. Pagan mythology is rather out of fashion. Even the poets often now assume that Clete is a name that requires an explanation, and that Daphne and her flight through the laurel do not bring up immediate memories of Syrinx and the reeds. The dictionary of Lempriere is covered with dust, and one may quote an episode from Ovid without an answering glance of comprehension from the hearer. This does not imply ignorance. It is only that in the modern system the old mythology is not taken very seriously. Since Latin and Greek have almost ceased to be a necessary part of a gentleman's education, there is no class of allusions from which we can draw to lighten or strengthen ordinary speech unless we turn to the Bible. This deprives conversation of much of its color, and renders it rather commonplace and meager. Unfortunately, to many among our young people, the Bible seems to be a book to be avoided or to be treated in a rather jocose manner. To raise a laugh on the vaudeville stage, a biblical quotation has only to be pronounced, and the weird comedian, when he is at a loss to get a witty speech across the footlights, is almost sure to speak of Jonah and the whale. It is disappointing to notice this gradual change that has taken place in the attitude of the younger generation toward the sacred book. The Sunday schools, in their attempt to make the genealogies of importance and to overload the memories of their little disciples with a multitude of texts, or to over-explain every allusion in the terms of physical geography, etc., may in a measure be responsible for this, but they cannot be entirely responsible. One must admit that diversities of interpretations of the sacred scriptures from a religious point of view will always be an obstacle to their use in schools, where the children of Jews, Mohammedans, and of the various Christian denominations assemble. But there is always the home where the first impetus to a satisfactory knowledge of the sacred book ought to be given. The decay of the practice of reading aloud in our homes is very evident in the lack of real culture, or rather rudiments of real culture, in our children. But there is no use in declaiming against this. Other times, other manners, accusatory declamation is simply a luxury of old age. Personally, my desultory reading of the Old and New Testaments gave me a background against which I could see the trend of the books I devoured more clearly. It added immensely to my enjoyment of them. Besides, it was a moral and ethical safeguard. It was easy even for a boy to discover the morality of the New Testament was the standard by which not only life, but literature should be judged. If there are great declamations full of dramatic fire, which nearly every boy at school learns to love in the Old Testament, there are the most moving, tender, and simple stories in the New. To the uncorrupted mind, to the unjaded mind, which has not been forced to look on books as mere recitals of exciting adventures, the Acts of the Apostles are full of entrancing episodes. It is very easy for a receptive youth to acquire a taste for St. Paul, and I soon learned that St. Paul was not only one of the greatest letter writers, but as a figure of history more interesting than Julius Caesar, and certainly more modern. Young people delight in human documents. They may not know why they delight in these documents, but it is because of their humanity. Now, who can be more human than St. Paul? And the more you read his epistles and the more you know of his life, the more human he becomes. He knew how to be angry and sin not, and the way he takes it out of those unreasonable people who would not accept his mission has always been a great delight to me. Under the spell of his writing, it was a pleasure to pick out the phrases of his history, a history that even then seemed to be so very modern, and to a boy with an unspoiled imagination, so very real. It seemed only natural that he should be converted by a blast of illumination from God. It is not hard for young people to accept miracles. All life is a miracle, and the rising and setting of the sun was to me no more of a miracle than the conversion of this fierce Jew who was a Roman citizen. He seemed so very noble and yet so very humble. He could command and plead and weep and denounce, and he made you feel that he was generally right. And then he was a tent maker who understood Greek and who could speak to the Greeks in their own language. Late in the 70s, when nearly every student I knew was a disciple of Huxley and Tyndall and devoted to that higher criticism of the Bible which was Germanizing us all, I fortified myself with St. Paul and with the belief that, if he could break the close exclusiveness of the Jews and take in the Gentiles, if he could throw off not contemptuously many of the rigid ceremonies of his people, Christianity in the modern time could very well afford to accept the new geological interpretation of the story of Genesis without destroying in any way the faith in which St. Paul preached. Somewhat later, too, when I read constantly and with increasing delight the letters of Madame de Sévigné, I put her second as a writer of letters to the great St. Paul. The letters of Lord Chesterfield to his sons came next, I think, long after. Andrew Lang's Letters to Dead Authors, and a very great letter I found in an English translation of Balzac's Le Lys dans la Vallée. It must not be understood that I put St. Paul in the same category with these mundane persons. Nevertheless, I found St. Paul very often reasonably mundane. He preferred to work as a tent maker rather than take money from his clients, and one could imagine him as preaching while he worked. He frankly made collections for needy churches, and he was very grateful to Phoebe for remembering that he was a hungry man and in need of homely hospitality. He was interested in his fellow passengers Aquila and Priscilla, whom he met on board the ship that was taking them from Corinth to Ephesus. It was evident that they had not been able to make their salt in Corinth, where, however, their poverty had not interfered with their zeal in the cause of Christ. Any tent marked Ephesus was sure to have a good sale anywhere. The tents from Ephesus were as fashionable as the purple from Tyre, and St. Paul was pleased that his 2 disciples should have a chance of being more prosperous. I always felt, too, that in this practical way, he knew that Ephesus would give him a better chance of supporting himself. That Saul of Tarsus had not lacked for luxuries in his youth, one easily guessed. It was plain, too, that he had had the best possible instructors, and I like to believe, when I was young, that his muscles had been well trained in the sports of gentlemen of his class. Altogether, so graphic were his descriptions, and so potent his personality, that while Julius Caesar and Brutus were seated, he filled the foreground, and all the more because of this time I picked up an English translation of Suetonius just by chance one dark winter day. And as I had not yet discovered that Suetonius was a yellow gossip, my idol, some of the Roman heroes, received a great shock. The constant reading of St. Paul led me to the Acts of the Apostles, and I found St. Luke very good reading, though I often wished that, as I understood he had some reputation as an artist, he had adorned his writings with illustrations. It was a great shock to discover that none of the apostles wrote in English, for it seemed to me that their styles were as different from one another as any styles could be, and as I, having lived a great part of my time in classes where Nepos and Caesar were translated by my dear young friends, had very little confidence in the work of any translator, I came to the conclusion that God had taken special care of the translators of the Bible, for I could not help believing that he had no interest whatever in the translations which he made daily for the impatient ears of our instructors. One could not help loving St. Paul, too, because he was such a good fighter. When he said he fought with beasts, I was quite sure that these beasts were the unreasonable and unrighteous persons who persecuted and contradicted him. No obstacle deterred him, and he was gentle, too, although he called things by their right names, and his denunciations were so vivid and mouth-filling that you knew his enemies must have been afraid to open their lips while he was near them, whatever they might have said behind his back. My devotion to St. Paul brought me into dispute one Friday at school, when discipline was relaxed and the teacher condescended to conversation. We were asked who was our favorite hero, and when it came to my turn I answered St. Paul. As George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, General Grant, General Lee, Napoleon, and Alexander the Great had walked in procession before, I produced my hero. I was looked on as rather weak-minded. The teacher, too, seemed astonished, and he asked me on what grounds I founded my worship. This question, coming suddenly, petrified me for a moment, and I answered, "He fought with beasts." This was taken as a personal allusion by some of my dear comrades with whom I had had altercations, and I was made to suffer for it as much as these dear comrades deemed prudent. However, they discovered that I had language on my side, for on the next composition day, when we read aloud the work of our brains, I accused them of being filled with all iniquity, and other evil things which brought down a horrified remonstrance from the teacher, who was unaccustomed to such plain English. But he was knocked high and dry by the proof that I was only quoting St. Paul of the Romans. Perhaps I become too familiar with St. Paul. Be that as may, I regarded him as a very good friend indeed, for some of his language, quoted in times of crisis, produced a much better effect on one's enemies than any swear word that could be invented. I am not excusing my attitude towards the Bible, but merely explaining how it affected my youthful mind. There was something extremely romantic in the very phrase, "the tumult of the silversmiths at Ephesus." It seemed to me a whole chapter of a novel in itself. And there was the good centurion. Christ always seemed to have a sympathy for soldiers, who was willing to save Paul when the ship on its way to Rome was run aground. So he reached Melita, where the amiable barbarian showed him no small courtesy. And one could not help liking the Romans, that is, the official Romans, even Felix, whose wife was a Jew like St. Paul, and who, disgusted when the apostle spoke to him of chastity and of justice to come, yet hoped that money would be given him by Paul, and frequently sent for and often spoke with him. And how fine seemed the apostle's belief in his nobility as a Roman citizen. He rendered unto Caesar the things that were Caesar's, and one could easily imagine the pomp and circumstance when Agrippa and Bernice entered into the hall of audience with the tribunes and principal men of the city, and one could hear St. Paul saying, protecting himself nobly through the nobility of a Roman law, "For it seemeth to me unreasonable to send a prisoner, and not to signify the things laid to his charge." And Agrippa's answer after Paul's apologia, "In a little thou persuadest me to become a Christian." But the story did not end then. I rehearsed over and over again that the King Agrippa might have said to his sister, the noble and beautiful Bernice, I knew nothing of the lady's reputation then, and how finally they did become Christians. In my imagination, princely dignity and exquisite grace were added to the external beauty of religion, and Paul went to Rome protected by the law of the Romans. And yet the very fineness of his attitude was the cause of his farther imprisonment. This man, I often repeated with Agrippa, might have been set at liberty if he had not appealed to Caesar. It was St. Paul who sent me back to the prophet Micah, who had previously struck me as of no importance at all, and I read, "And thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, art a little one among the thousands of Judah. Out of thee shall he come forth unto me, that is to be the ruler in Israel. And his going forth is from the beginning, from the days of eternity." And back again to St. Matthew. "And they said to him in Bethlehem of Judah, For so it is written by the prophet, And thou, Bethlehem, the land of Judah, art not the least among the princes of Judah. For out of thee shall come forth the captain, who shall rule my people, Israel." These exercises in completing the prophecies of the Old Testament with the fulfillment of the New were interesting, and I found great pleasure in them, and this led me to a greater appreciation of the Old Testament, against which I had been once rather prejudiced. One day I was led by some reference or other in another book to read the 23rd Psalm of David in the King James Version. It struck me as much more simple and appealing than the version in the Dua Bible, which begins in Latin, Dominus regit me. It runs, "The Lord ruleth me, and I shall want nothing. He hath set me in a place of pasture. He hath brought me up on the water of refreshment. He hath converted my soul. He hath led me on the paths of justice for his own name's sake. For though I should walk in the midst of the shadow of death, I fear no evils, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they have comforted me. Thou hast prepared a table before me against them that afflict me. Thou hast anointed my head with oil, and my chalice which inebriated me, how goodly it is. And thy mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and that I may dwell in the house of the Lord unto length of days." In the Dua version, this psalm was called the 22nd. Without any special guidance, I think, most of my teachers would have looked on as dangerous any attempt to ally English literature with the Bible. I soon discovered that nearly everything I read owed something to the Bible. At first, the comparison of the 23rd Psalm in the King James Version enraptured me so much that I began to find fault with the Latinized phrases of the Vulgate in English. It was the fashion in the early 70s to be very Saxon in speech, especially in the little group at school interested in English literature. Streetcars at this time were comparatively new in Philadelphia, and I think we reached the last extremity of Saxonism in speech when we spoke of them as folkwains. The tide then turned towards the Latins, and I preferred the book of Job and the story of Ruth in the Latinized version, because the words were more mouth-filling, and because it was very difficult to translate everything into a bold, early English medium, which for a time I had been trying to do. It was Keats' lovely phrase, "amid the alien corn," which sent me back to Ruth, and a quotation from Quackenbos's Rhetoric, "Canst thou hook the Leviathan," which made me revel in Job. Something Meg Merrilees said bore me on towards the roaring storm of Isaiah. The Latinized medium seemed to suit his denunciations best. And then, besides, I found more illuminating footnotes in the Dua version than in the King James. In both versions, some passages were so obscure that I often wondered how anybody could get any meaning out of them. I was often astonished to find in English novels that the old people in the cottages were soothed by texts, quoted at a great length, out of which I could make nothing. So I limited myself to the Dua version, which I found more illuminating. Whether my system of reading is to be commended or not to young persons, I am not prepared to say, but for me it made the Bible a really live book. To be frank, and perhaps shocking at the same time, if anybody had asked me whether being marooned on an island, I should have most preferred the Bible in my loneliness, I should promptly have answered no. At this age, Nicholas Nickleby, or Midsummer Night's Dream, or The Tempest, or As You Like It, or Macaulay's Lays of Ancient Rome would have suited me better, provided, of course, that I could have chosen only one book. It was borne in on me many times that no author could improve on the phrasing of the Bible. Both in the Vulgate and the King James versions, there are passages which, leaving aside all question of doctrine, it is sacrilege to try to improve. The French translation of the Bible is, as everybody knows, very paraphrasistic, and that may account for the fact that, while regarded as a precious depository of doctrine, it is not a household book. And the dreadfully dull interpretations of Clement Marot, called hymns, naturally bored a people who, in their heads, believe that God listens more amiably to petitions uttered in the language of the Academy. In their novels dealing with the beginnings of Christianity, and there are many such novels in French unknown in other countries, it is hard for a French author not to be rhetorical in the manner of the writer of Ben-Hur when the death of Christ is described. No human author could improve on the words of the Vulgate or the words of the King James Version. What young heart can ponder over these words without a thrill? When Jesus therefore had seen his mother, and the disciple standing whom he loved, he saith to his mother, Woman, behold thy son. After that he saith to the disciple, Behold thy mother. And from that day the disciple took her to his own. Afterwards, Jesus, knowing that all things were now accomplished, that the scripture might be fulfilled, said, I thirst. Now there was a vessel set there full of vinegar, and they, putting a sponge full of vinegar about hysops, put it to his mouth. And Jesus, therefore, when he had taken the vinegar, said, It is consummated, and bowing his head, gave up the ghost. When Marie Corelli became a popular author, there were persons existing happily, they have all gone to the great beyond, who thought that the talented author could have done better. I am aware that many persons look on Emerson as somewhat dangerous reading for a boy of 16. The mothers and fathers of my Baptist friends and the uncle of my Methodist cousins forbade the reading of Emerson because of his Unitarianism. But as the rector of our parish never denounced Unitarians from the altar, though he frequently offered his compliments to Martin Luther, I paid no attention whatever to these objections. I trust that I am not defending the miscellaneous reading of my boyhood. I do not recommend this course to the approval of parents and guardians. I am simply expressing the impression that certain books made on my youthful mind and heart, for, though I never said so in words, the books I liked were always nearer to my heart than to my mind. I owe a great debt to Emerson. It was on a hot afternoon during the summer vacation that near sundown, sitting on the warm marble steps of our house, I dipped into an early edition of Emerson. I felt inspired at once to think great thoughts and to do good things, to lift myself above the petty things of the earth, and feel that to be an American was to be set at once proud and humble. Emerson's abrupt sentences, like a number of brilliants set close together, reminded me of Proverbs. But the book of Proverbs did not get so near to my actual life as the essays of Emerson. I liked the lessons that he drew from the lives of great men. I was shocked when he mentioned Confucius and Plato in the same breath as Christ. But I was amiably tolerant, for I felt that he had never had the privilege of studying the little catechism, and I thought of writing to him on the subject. But somebody told me that he was an American classic, and from that I concluded he was dead, and had doubtless already found out his mistake. Perhaps I might have been better engaged in reading the more practical books offered to boys in our own time, if we had had them. There were some books then on scientific subjects, reduced to the comprehension of the young, but not so many as there are now. One of my uncles recommended the works of Samuel Smiles. Self-help, I think, was his favorite. But Samuel Smiles never appealed to me. My small allowance, paid weekly, could not have been affected by thrift, and when my uncle quoted passages from this tiresome book, I astounded him by replying in a phrase I wrongly attributed to the adorable Emerson, that if I had had a quarter to spend instead of 12 cents, I would give half of it for a hyacinth. My miserly uncle said it sounded just like Muhammad, and that Emerson had doubtless found it in that dangerous book, the Quran. I cannot imagine any other author doing for me just what the essays of Emerson did. In the first place, they seem to me to be really American. In the second, and largely because of their quality, they offered an antidote to the materialism in the very air which had succeeded the Civil War. At this time, there was much talk of money and luxury everywhere about us. Even in our quiet neighborhood, where simple living was the rule, many had burst into ostentation and moved away into newer and more pretentious quarters. And there was a rumor that some of these sought unlimited opportunities for extravagant expenditure. We saw them driving in new carriages and condescendingly stopping before the white doors and green window shutters of our old-fashioned colonial houses. They had made money through the war. For the first time in our lives, we boys heard of money making as the principal aim of life. The fact that these successful persons were classified as shoddy did not lessen the value of the auriferous atmosphere about us. Emerson was a corrective to this materialism. As to his philosophy or theology, that did not concern me any more than the religious opinions of Julius Caesar, whose commentaries I was obliged to read. Emerson gave me a taste for the reading of essay. By chance, I fell upon some essays of Carlyle. The inflation of his style did not deter me from thoroughly enjoying the paper on novelists. That on Caligostro, however, was my favorite. It introduced me intimately to the French Revolution. I disliked this great charlatan for his motto, "Tread the lilies underfoot." I was for the Bourbons. The French Revolution, as a fact, was very near to me. My mother had been born in Philadelphia in 1819, and my great-uncle and my grandfather had lived through the French Revolution. There was a legend, moreover, probably the same legend exists in every family of Irish descent whose connections had lived in France, that one of them had been a clerk to Fabre Degoltine, and had spent his time in crossing off the list of the condemned the names of the Irish-French aristocrats, and substituting in their place others that did not happen to belong to Celts. In spite of the little catechism and the uplifting influence of Emerson, I looked on this probably mythical gentleman as one of the glories of our family. And then there was an old man, very old, who walked up and down 6th Street with his head wrapped in a bandana handkerchief, bearing a parrot on his shoulder. The boys of the neighborhood believed that he was Samson, the executioner of Louis and Marie Antoinette. We shivered when we saw him, but we boasted of his existence in our neighborhood all the same. After I had read Caligostro, I devoured every line on the subject of the French Revolution I could find. It seemed to me that I would have been willing to give 5 years out of my life to have lived in Paris during those horrors, and to have rescued Marie Antoinette and the Princess Elizabeth. Such brutality seemed impossible in our time, and yet I have since lived very near to friends who went through even greater horrors in Russia. The Baroness Sophie du Buxhovenden, second lady in waiting to the Tsarina, for instance, whose letters lie before me as I write. In spite of my taste for Carlyle, which induced me to dip into Jean-Paul Richter, of whose writings I remember only one line, "I love God and little children," I did not get very far into his French Revolution. It seemed then an unreal and lurid book. Emerson led to Montaigne, whose essays, in an old edition which I had from the Mechanics' Institute, of which my father was a committeeman, delighted me beyond words. I liked Emerson's essay on friendship better than his, but for wit, quick repertoire, general cheerfulness, he reminded me of my favorite heroine in literature, Sir Walter Scott's Catherine Seton. Later, I read with astonishment that Montaigne was an unbeliever, a skeptic, almost a cynic. I was extremely indignant. He seemed to me to be a very pious gentleman, with that wit and humor which I seldom found in professedly pious books. And to this day I cannot hear Montaigne talked of as a precursor of Voltaire without believing that there is something crooked in the mind of the talker. So much for the impressions made in youth, so much for the long, long thoughts of which Longfellow sings. Who is more amusingly cheerful than Montaigne? Who more amusingly wise? Who so well bred and attractive? Who knew the world better and took it only as the world? Give me the old volume of Montaigne and a loaf of bread, no Victrola singing to me in the wilderness, a thermos bottle, and one or two other things, and I can still spend the day in any wild place. I did not, of course, know in those early days what in his flavor attracted me. Afterward, I found that it was the very flavor and essence of old France. Carlyle's impressions of historical persons interested me, but Montaigne was the most actual of living persons who spoke to me in a voice I recognized as wholly his. To be sure, I read him in Floriot's translation. I think it was about this time, too, that I discovered a very modern writer who charmed me very greatly. It was Justin Mccarthy who contributed a series of sketches of great men of the day to a magazine called The Galaxy. He did Victor Emmanuel and Pope Pius and Bismarck and many other of the worthies of the times. Nothing that he wrote before or after this pleased me at all, but these sketches were so interesting and apparently so true that they really became part of my life. If I had been asked at this time who was my favorite of all modern authors and what the name of the composer I admired most, I should have said Justin Mccarthy and Offenbach. I regarded Voici le Sabre in La Grande Duchesse as a masterpiece only to be compared to an Avram by Pergolesi, which was often sung in St. Philip's Church at the offertory. A strange mixture, but the truth is the truth. Although I have not been able to find Justin Mccarthy's series of sketches, they still hold a sweet place in my memory. Perhaps, like other masterpieces that one loves in youth, one would now find them like those beautiful creatures of the sea that seem to be vermilion and purple and gold under the waves, but are drab and ugly things when taken out of the water. This applies to some books that one reads with pleasure in early days, and wonders later how they were endured. There were not so many outdoor books in the late 60s as there are now. We were all sent to Thoreau's Walden and Dana's 2 Years Before the Mast. Walden I learned to dislike, but I much preferred Fenimore Cooper's description of nature. Walden struck me as the book of a man playing at out of doors, imagining his wildness, and never really liking to be too far from the town. Singularly enough, it was not until I discovered Hamerton's A Painter's Camp that I began to see that nature had beauties in all weathers. In truth, I hate to confess that nature alone never appealed to me. A landscape without human beings seemed deadly dull, and I did not understand until I grew much older that I had really believed that good art was an improvement on nature. I have not the slightest idea in what light the modern critics see the work of Philip Gilbert Hamerton. I tried to read one of his novels recently and failed. But let me say that, allowing for receptivity and what one may call temperament, I know of no book more revealing as to the reflections of nature and art than A Painter's Camp. I recall vividly the words of the beginning of the preface to the first edition. It is known to all who are acquainted with the present condition of the fine arts in England that landscape painters rely less on memory and invention than formerly, and that their work from nature is much more laborious than it used to be. I have seen so many pictures that seem to be made up in the artist's studio, and I knew so well from my experience in the drawing classes at school how nature was neglected for artificial models, that I hailed these words with great joy. Everything in life was rather conventional, rather fixed, for the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia, to which our century owes the beginning of the aesthetic awakening, to which our country owes... That's a funny sentence. Had not yet taken place. It may seem strange to this generation that we were limited to the woodcuts of Gaudí's Lady's Book, the illustrations in Harper's Magazine, and an occasional picture in some short-lived periodical. The reign of the chromo had just begun. Rogers groups were a fixture in nearly every self-respecting house, though I am glad to say in my own family very good casts of the Clytie and the discus thrower filled their place. My father greatly admired Power's Greek slave, whose praises had been celebrated in the Cosmopolitan magazine, but my mother regarded it as almost improper. Nearly every youth of my generation in Philadelphia wanted not exactly something better, but something more vivid. There were few sports. Long walks and a little cricket supplied the place of the coming baseball and tennis. In his Steeplejack, James Hunker speaks of his weekly walks with Mr. Edward Roth, the head of a military school and author of Christius Judex. I too looked on these walks with an occasional row on the Schuylkill, with him as the best part of my education. But this was later. All we could do then in our moments of leisure was to walk and talk and read. The cult of the out-of-doors had not yet begun to be developed. The beginning of a painter's camp was the most attractive to my thirsty soul. Mr. Hamerton says, I had a wild walk yesterday. I have a notion of encamping on the Bolesworth moors to steady heather, and heartily tired of being caged up here in my library, with nothing to see but wet garden walks and dripping yew trees, and a sundial, whereon no shadow had fallen the livelong day, I determined, in spite of the rain, to be off to the moors, to choose a site for my encampment. Not very far from this house still dwells an old servant of my uncle's, with whom I am on the friendliest terms. So I called upon this neighbor on my way, and asked him if he would take a walk with me to the hills. Jamie stared a little and remarked that "Iter fee for wit," but accompanied me nevertheless, and a very pleasant walk we had of it. Hamerton opened his book in Jane Eyre's country. Our family had lately read Jane Eyre. This added interest to the volume, and there came the details of the invention of the new hut, intended to be a shelter against all weathers, so that the artist might study nature on intimate terms. He made it in order to paint the heather at close range. Now this was a revelation. It had never hitherto occurred to me that the heather changes its aspect day to day, or indeed that our pet place of beauty, the Wissahickon Creek, or river if you like, was not the same every day in the year, except when the ice bound it. This may seem a rather stupid state of mind, but it is the stupidity that is very common. I could understand how interesting it would be to be in the snowfall while yet safely out of it. Mr. Hamerton thus described his hut. It consists entirely of panels, of which the largest are 2 feet 6 inches square. These panels can be carried separately on pack horses, or even on men's backs, and then united together by iron bolts into a strong little building. 4 of the largest panels serve as windows, being each of them filled with a large pane of excellent plate glass. When erected, the walls present a perfectly smooth surface outside and a paneled interior, the floor being formed in exactly the same manner, with the paneled or coffered side turned towards the earth, and the smooth surface uppermost. By this arrangement, all the wall bolts are inside and those of the floor underneath it, which protects them not only from the weather, but from theft, an iron bolt being a great temptation to country people on account of its convenience and utility. The walls are bolted to the floor, which gives great strength to the whole structure, and the panels are carefully ordered like the stones in a well-built wall, so that the joints of the lower course of panels do not fall below those of the upper. The roof is arched and provides a current of fresh air by placing ventilators at each end of the arch, which ensures a current without inconvenience to the occupant. The chapters on concerning moonlight and old castles, the coming of the clouds, and the little sketches like Loch Awe after sunset, September 23rd, 1860, enchanted me. It had not before struck me that Loch Awe was different on September 23rd, 1860, from what it was at other times, or, to carry the idea farther, that the imperial Delaware had changed since that momentous time, when George Washington crossed it, or the Schuylkill since Tom Moore looked upon it. To quote farther, the mountain is grey-green, colder and greener towards the summit. All details of field and wood are dimly visible. 2 islands nearer me are distinct against the hill, but their foliage seems black and no details are visible in them. The sky is all clouded over. From the horizon to the zenith, it is one veil of formless vapor. And there is one streak of dead calm which reflects the green mountain perfectly from edge to edge of it. There is another calm shaped like a great river, which is all green touched with crimson. Besides these, there are delicate half-calms just dulled over with faint breathings of the evening air. These, for the most part, being violet from the sky, except at a distance, where they take a deep crimson. And there is one piece of crimson calm near me, set between a faint violet breeze and a calm of a different violet. There are 1 or 2 breezes sufficiently strong to cause a ripple, and these rippled spaces take the dull gray slate of the upper sky. Realize this picture as well as you may be able, and then put in the final touch. Between the dull calms and the grassy calms, there are drawn thin threads of division burning with scarlet fire. This fire is, of course, got from the lower sky. I know whence it comes, but how or why it lies in those thin scarlet threads there where it is most wanted and not elsewhere, I cannot satisfactorily explain. Then there was a delightful and illuminating chapter called A Stream at Rest. Hamerton, who is probably now very much out of fashion, taught me this necessity of beauty and life, and as an accessory to Emerson, the philosophy of enjoying the little everyday things. It was Emerson who, I think, said first to me, "Take short outlooks," and I still think that there can be no better introduction to a consideration of the relation of art to nature than a painter's camp. It was a painter's camp which led me to the intellectual life. There is a particular passage in Hamerton's chapter on a little French city that emphasized the need of beauty. The cathedral is all poetry. I mean that every part of it affects our emotional nature, either by its own grandeur or beauty, or by its allusion to histories of bright virtue or brave fortitude. And this emotional result is independent of belief in the historical truth of these great legends. It would be stronger, no doubt, if we believed them, but we are still capable of feeling their solemn poetry and large significance, as we feel the poetry and significance of Sir Galahad or the Idylls of the King. Some persons are so constituted that it is necessary to their happiness to live near some noble work of art or nature. A mountain is satisfactory to them because it is great and ever new, presenting itself every hour under aspect so unforeseen that one can gaze at it for years with unflagging interest. To some minds, to mine among others, human life is scarcely supportable, far from some stately and magnificent object, worthy of endless study and admiration. But what of life in the plains? Truly, most plains are dreary enough, but still they may have fine trees or a cathedral. And in the cathedral here, I find no despicable compensation for the loss of dear old Ben Cruicha. There are some humorous and perhaps even comic passages in the intellectual life. These passages are unconsciously humorous or comic, as Mr. Philip Gilbert Hamerton seems to have no sense of humor. For instance, it was a great surprise to me to discover that poverty was unfavorable to the intellectual life. It was enlightening to know the reason why a man should wear evening dress after 6 o'clock, and why the sporting of grey clothes in the evening was unworthy of the intellectual. Besides, it affects the character. And I think at 44 minutes in, it's time for another pause here. We are now just on page 71. A little ways to go. Not far, just 5 or 6 pages more. But my voice needs a rest, and so I will return later in the near future to complete the chapter. I hope you've enjoyed this.